There's a reason you shouldn't put all your eggs in one basket. It's because if you put all your eggs in one basket, if something hits the basket, all the eggs will break at once. Now that seems pretty obvious and self-explanatory. How useful is that today in this day and age? And what are we referring to? All right, what do we need to split up? What do we need to diversify? Welcome back to the With Joe Wehbe Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Wehbe. And today we're talking about why you must build interests or die trying. Yesterday we were talking about community. And now we're going to talk about interests and see if they relate at all. So I think I can definitely pinpoint a time in my life where I made this crucial mistake. I believe, although I don't want to, forgive me, I don't want to talk about it in that much detail. There's certain times where I think, firstly, university. I think I put all my eggs in one basket, expecting that path to kind of be everything in my life at that point in time. So I studied a psychology degree, and I was kind of meant to be pursuing my film dream on the side, but I really, I just got so lazy and uninspired about that, and I really just put all my eggs in one basket with studying psychology, and that didn't really feel fulfilling. And then I think I came to a point where I was basically looking for a romantic relationship to kind of fill the void. And that put way too much pressure and expectation on even romantic relationships. And that led to some pretty nasty kind of experiences, especially for me, just to be quite honest with you. And I'm sure that's the case for many people out there. It may depend, it may differ, the muse may differ, may be very different. But there's all sorts of things where we expect our job or our partner or a particular group of friends or just one friend, we kind of project everything onto them that we want and need in our life. And it's often too much. It's too much for people. Okay, it's not fair, and no one wants to be that for someone else, but also no pursuit wants to be that for you. It's different to focus. What I'm talking about is where we invest our self-esteem or our image, or where we drive our value and identity from. We can't invest that in one thing. It's different to being very focused and deliberate with what we're doing. So put it this way, if you were to have $10 million and you were going to invest that money, would you spend that $10 million on one investment? Would you buy maybe one big property or shares in one company? If you don't know what you're doing, that's probably not a good bet. All right. If you're Warren Buffett and you know that's there's one bet you got to make that's going to pay off big, and you know the game well, very different. For most people, you'd be better off splitting that $10 million up, maybe buying a whole bunch of properties worth $1 million each. And that way, if one was destroyed by a storm or swept away, okay, it wouldn't be great, wouldn't be fun, but you'd still have 9. I think I just held up 4 fingers. You'd still have 9. You still have 9 left. And so it's very hard for everything to go wrong at once when you've diversified yourself that way, when you've spread your eggs and not put them in one basket. Now, my point today, my contention is that for you, that diversification should be in the form of interests. Now, what is an interest? An interest is something that you're interested in. You don't need permission to have interests. There is nothing you should be ashamed of being interested in. Doesn't mean you have to share it. Midget porn comes to mind. So those interests, sure, but there might be others that are things you could actually hook into and get proactive on. And there's not really much need to have a shortage of those, right? Interests are your best asset. And you can look at many of the philosophers, I've come across it in DeMello and things like that, who talk about in our lives, we need a range of things that we identify with, participate in, so that we don't get caught into any one thing. We don't get anchored. Because if you're anchored to one thing and that thing falls, then you're going to go down with it. And that's basically it. The most common and tragic form of this is in romantic relationships, but it happens in all sorts of things. Okay, and people are far less objective when they identify and rely and depend is the word, depend on one thing to create all the substance in their life. Even family is not an exception. So interests are diversified. So I think of this as a concept basically of interest wealth. So we should all aim to have interest wealth, or a wealth of interests. Be curious and fascinated and itchy and want to scratch ourselves on a whole bedrock of things, a whole smorgasbord of things that are cool, that excite us, that intrigue us, that prompt further inquiry, investigation. And there's no shortage. I mean, how can you have a shortage of interests? I mean, that just doesn't quite make sense. Okay, we're not extolling that many more resources to come up with more things we're interested in. Most people's problem is that they have fuck all interests, right? Most people are really bad at doing what tomorrow we're going to talk about as we're building up to interest mapping, which is the tool that ultimately helps you do this most effectively. It helps you map them out and realize more things you're interested in. And then when you think about it, those things are the best place to start when you want to do a project, when you want to connect with people, when you want to be a more interesting person at parties, when you want to have more depth to your character, more learning. Interests are the seeds that plant your real journeys. And if you think about anyone you've looked up to in terms of their external achievements in the world, the ones who do it fearlessly are following their interests. They're tackling problems all of the time, but those problems are handcuffed and interwoven with interest. They're interested in getting busy on that problem. So when I was at school, all right, so when I was 18, I was probably widely interested in things, but I wasn't that conscious of them. And I didn't have permission. I didn't give myself permission to investigate a lot of them, because we have this myth that we can only follow one path in our culture. And we're going to talk about where that myth comes from in coming episodes. But for now, let's bring focus back to what our interests are currently, because that's something you can reflect on today as your prompt for the day. So when I was at school, we've written about this in the book we've got coming out, especially Joshua Hodges' chapter is really powerful, and how it talks about how he wished he'd found interest mapping. Probably would have saved him 7 years of his life, because he just would have become conscious of what he was interested in and found opportunities that match that. Think about myself. When I was 18, I was probably interested in sport, right? Rugby league and soccer. I was interested in film and making movies. I was interested in faith, I would say at the time. I would have called it faith. I was interested in psychology and human behavior, and anything else. I think literature, I think they would have been the main things, right? Film, popular culture. So they would have been the main things. And tomorrow, I'll talk about a recent example of my own interest mapping, and you can see how it's kind of evolved, and you see the benefit of it having evolved. Now, last thought, there's a blog post on this, You Must Build Interests or Die Tryin, available on my website, www.withjoewehbe.com. This is obviously in the blog, where a lot of the podcast material is sourced. And I put in a quote there from Viktor Frankl when he talks about Sunday neurosis. So I want to talk about this and see if it resonates with you. He talked about this concept in Man's Search for Meaning, and basically referred to it as that kind of depression which afflicts people who become aware of the lack of content in their lives when the rush of the busy week is over and the void within themselves becomes manifest. Victor, he had a way with words. And it's incredibly powerful, this concept of when you're Sunday afternoon, how many of you, as I have, feel emptiest, most empty? And interest wealth, getting these interests mapped out, is basically diversification and protection against that. Getting too much anxiety from one thing, because you're relying on one thing. So you can think about what your interests are today. I've talked about what an early version of mine were, and tomorrow we can talk about interest mapping and expanding on that. So thank you very much for joining us on the With Joe Wehbe podcast. And just remember, as always, that the best way to open 1,000 doors for you is to concentrate on opening doors for others. Thank you.